go.
Okay.
3, 2, 1. Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, and I'm very happy to welcome Renee Johnston back. How are you doing today, Renee?
I am okay. I'm racing. I don't know why I do this to myself. I got 80,000 things happening today, but I was like, this is going to work out perfectly.
It's
I
because
can get on with Chris for like an hour, a little bit over an hour, and then we'll be good to go.
well, you actually do things, and I respect that, and I'm glad that you actually do things. It's one of the people who actually do things are the people I want people to hear from, so that's good. But I understand that it can make things a little tight.
It does, but that's okay. We've got some time. I'm volunteering at my son's school at a thing at 1 o'clock. So I've got like a 35-minute drive. So if we're off by 12:15, I should be good.
We should be. We should be. That works within my plans too, if that helps.
Good.
So I will say we're not going to talk about it. I will acknowledge that you have been the target of some drama recently, and it's making me laugh. But we're going to ignore it today. So, folks, please don't talk about it in the chat either. We're here to talk about education.
Which is a major.
It is.
Major.
And I don't see, even progressive Democrats, other than paying lip service to public school, don't really seem to have any actual plan for education other than to say they support public school while quietly asking Bill Gates and Michael Bloomberg and Jeff Bezos to come in and tell them why all the schools should be charter after COVID.
Right. And charter schools they're like the worst combination. And okay, let me be clear. Not every charter school is awful because I don't know what all of them are. I don't know how they all run. I'm sure that somewhere there is a charter school where the people in charge actually care that the students learn something.
So I will tell you my theory, and you can tell me whether you believe it or not. You have more experience in the educational field than I do. I'm an outside observer whose primary experience in the field of education is a very angry student. So I don't know if I'm the best person always for some of the inside stuff. But my feeling is, we complain a lot about public education, and some public schools are really bad, but some public schools are also really good.
Yeah.
There are reasons why some public schools are really bad and why some public schools are really good that need to be talked about. They have to do with zip codes and property tax bases and how schools are funded, and the fact that people in Beverly Hills don't want to pay for the high schools in South Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And you have to keep all that in mind when you're complaining about public school. That said, even though I just singled out South Los Angeles, the actual South Los Angeles high school is actually a really good school that people like Sparky Anderson graduated from. And it's one of the few, it was one of the few integrated parts of Los Angeles for years and years and years. It was a well-funded school with both black and white students where the student body pretty much got along, and is pretty much famous for athletes and sports personalities of both black and white ancestry. But it's an exception, not a rule. Most of the schools in South Los Angeles are not doing as well as South Los Angeles High School.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the charters move in there because, they look at the fact that lots of public schools aren't good, and they say, public schools suck. You need an alternative.
Right.
Now, you notice that nobody's school choice alternative is to let people get transfers from bad schools to good schools inside the same district.
Right.
My idea of school choice instead of giving people school vouchers to go to private schools or Christian schools, would be to let every parent who wants in the city of Los Angeles send their kids to all the best high schools in the city and force the district to refinance and make other schools good in order to be able to make sure that all their parents are happy. But we don't see that kind of school choice.
No.
We see school choice ideas that would undermine that public education.
Right. That'll just pull kids who are able to go and leave the public school system to other places. So there's a lot about where money comes from for education that I think people are really misguided about. I don't know that people fully understand that their property taxes is what in part funds schooling.
You probably know this because you work in the school system, but
right.
I was totally freaked out to find out that a private corporation controls 80% of school book fairs in America.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Yeah, but that's always been. I mean,
I know.
Even when I was a kid, but
yes, it's been the same company the whole time, Scholastic.
Yeah.
And the reason I found this out is because of part of the right-wing attack on education.
Right.
Scholastic has a competitor. Well, they have 11 competitors to be technical, but most of those competitors are just happy with whatever tiny market share they're not trying to make waves because they don't want to lose anything to a bigger company. But there's an exception.
Right.
Brave Books. Now, I want to point out that Brave Books is run by a guy who, as soon as I was reading this guy's bio on the Brave Books website, I was like, I better go to the classic learning test page to see if he's on the board, because it really read that way. But he isn't. He's just that same kind of person, same kind of white person with that same kind of attitude about education.
Right.
But Brave Books is it was founded by a guy who was so disgusted by the state of inappropriate content in publishing that he immediately turned to Kevin Sorbo to write about manhood in order to put appropriate content for children out there. He's also Kirk Cameron's publisher, just to give you an idea of the content that Brave Books is pushing. So with that in mind, Kevin Sorbo and Kirk Cameron's publisher, the CEO really sounds like he should be on the board of some of these other anti-schooling organizations, and yet he's not. So I guess that's good. But they decided that they should start attacking Scholastic by saying Scholastic is too woke. They're putting inappropriate content in school book fairs, and you should really pay us to give your school a good moral book fair with good American values instead. And of course, by American values, they mean white Christian values.
Right.
So with this in mind, Scholastic's response to this huge combination smear campaign and you should give us your money instead campaign was, in order to protect their market share, to put a censorship button in their options to sell book fairs to schools. So you now have a choice. You can hit the woke button or the censorship button,
right,
and have the real book fair with all the content, or you can choose to block all the stuff that acknowledges Black people and gay people exist and are people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I will say that some of the stuff in Scholastic's quote-unquote socially inclusive line is actually pretty bad writing,
mm-hmm,
and very social and very superficially anti-racist. Look, you too can be a Supreme Court justice if you just work hard like Ketanji Brown Jackson did.
Right.
And there's an inherent lie in that we shouldn't be telling kids.
Right.
But people aren't saying put in this censorship button because we don't want people lying about how everyone can really become a Supreme Court judge in school. No, they're putting in the censorship button because we don't want to tell people that black people can become Supreme Court justices in the United States.
Right.
And that's a problem.
Right.
But where the problem comes from is the fact that for all these years, schools have been so crappily funded that a private company has to run all their book fairs.
Right.
And this was missed and I want to give Judd Legume and Popular Information credit. This is good journalism. People need to know this was happening. New York Times picked it up. It's important. There are important aspects to it, and it's good to know how big companies like Scholastic are responding to these right-wing attacks.
Right.
However, I was disappointed in the fact that the journalism really missed the fact that this is only a problem because capitalism controls our school book fairs in the first place.
Well, they're never going to point that part out.
But that's really the thing, though, is that
right.
Capitalism controls our school book fairs. And I know you already know this, and I know that I probably sound boring to you.
No.
But as a private citizen who didn't know this, I really want everyone to understand that capitalism controls our school book fairs. And it did even in the days when we thought our public schools were strong.
Right. But, and you know, and the question of the day is, as you say that, is there really an era where all the public schools were strong?
Well, no, because in the period when we talk about our public schools being strong, that was when white public schools were strong and black public schools were discriminated against horribly on the financial end, which ironically is exactly the situation we're in today.
Right, right. Because those are the schools that transitioned to be the urban area underfunded schools. Yeah.
I will say two things. One of these, I say this as an angry working class white person, and that should be taken into account. But we did busing wrong. If we wanted to do busing right, we would have closed down all the nice white schools and bused all the rich white kids to black schools.
Yeah.
Now, people will say, well, that's racially traumatizing. Well, I think it's a whole lot less racially traumatizing to have a small cadre of comfortably well-off white kids in a black school and force them to acculturate to working-class black culture than it is to do the other way around and force strategically chosen handfuls of black kids to accommodate middle-class white culture.
Right. But, you know, the concern is very, very rarely about the effect that these things have on black children.
Oh, I know.
Right? Like, the more I had never thought about it, you know, when people talk about the integration of schools, right? And you know, these brave black children that that went out there and fought the crowd and, you know, anything about that. It was traumatizing for those children.
Yes.
Right. And so.
And they were exposed to that trauma in front of the news cameras all over the country for the quote unquote good of society.
Right. And every day, all day. And they were children.
And it's the same thing when you look at, and I'm going to jump out of education but it's the same thing when you look at the desegregation of baseball. Baseball was desegregated in such a way that black athletes bore all the trauma of the desegregation process.
Right.
And that it was only when you saw a white manager who really liked a black player that anybody stood up for the black players who desegregated baseball.
Right.
The punishment for the three Southern baseball players who refused to welcome Jackie Robinson to the Brooklyn Dodgers and were instead assholes to him.
Mm-hmm.
Their punishment was at the end of that season they were traded, but that didn't help Jackie Robinson that season
Right.
Now, it did deny them of all the successful fame and fortune that might have come from being associated with the Brooklyn Dodgers in their very best years. But it also didn't hurt them that much because most of them ended up on the New York Giants, who are also getting ready to go into their very best years. So it's not as it's not as an ironic, oh, this guy was looking out for Jackie Robinson as it really looks like. No, he just wanted to make sure he had a couple of those guys on the Giants when he got fired from the Dodgers.
Right.
And you see that in our society where we make black people pay all the price of making society more just and put all the stress on the black people being admitted into white spaces, when what we really need to do is get rid of white spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's me
being cranky as a working class white person who thinks that middle class and wealthy white people are really screwing the rest of us over.
Yeah. Right.
I feel like they should bear more of. I feel like the well-off should bear more of society's trauma than they actually do.
100%, and they're never going to. Well, let's not say never, but for now, that's just not.
For them to do so, we would have to have the kind of society that reorganized itself to treat the well-off and the comfortable and the white like everyone else. And when that happens, you hear what you hear about Cuba. Oh my God, it's authoritarian, it's totalitarian. They're locking people up. Well, what did those people do before they locked up? They were landlords and CEOs. You see why they got locked up?
Yep. Yeah.
And when I look at education, as a former student, and more than that, as a former student in a quote unquote good public school, because I mean, look at me. I'm not going to pretend that I went to one of these schools that was being economically shafted. I grew up even though my parents were more working class than middle class, I grew up in a middle class neighborhood. My parents were trying to hold on to what they thought was middle class status, but really wasn't. They had naive ideas about America and were disabused of them. And I wish that more people responded to their being disabused of those ideas than my parents did, because far too many middle-class white people just become awful people. And somehow my parents didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I love them for that. I won't pretend they're perfect, but I mean, I love them for not becoming awful people in a situation where lots of other people who had the same experiences did become awful people. But that said, I think there's an argument to be made that public school does suck, but it's not. Yeah. But the argument that public school does suck is to be made because of the way we do schooling, whether it's public or private. Which is to say, we treat schooling as a combination job training and daycare program without really thinking about what kids are supposed to get out of it.
Right. And so we have part of this conversation was going to be about homeschooling.
Yes.
And of
now,
course,
I will say that for me, and this is important for you to understand if we're going to go there, for me, homeschooling was my rescue from how shitty school is.
So just know, I don't have an issue with homeschooling.
Oh, good. Now, I do have a problem with Christian homeschooling, but I have a problem with Christian schooling of all kinds.
Right. So I feel like homeschooling is one of those things where it really depends on the reason behind why you've chosen to homeschool, one, and what the ultimate goal is for why you're homeschooling your child, right? So if you've decided that you're going to pull your child out of school because, they're talking too much about history and Black people and identity and blah, 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 right? Like, okay, like your homeschool opportunity for your child is basically to keep them in a bubble where they're never going to be exposed to anything that is literally what should be the point of education, which is to expose people to things so they can learn to critically think, right?
And let me say that learning real history was not a risk in my school, because even at my good school, we had slightly obsolete textbooks that still tried to say things like the Civil War was about states' rights and not slavery. Right. So when even people who go to quote unquote good public schools are getting textbooks that are teaching things that nobody who actually teaches history believes anymore at that point, that's a problem. So, and that's more of a problem than the quote unquote CRT panic about something even close to actual history.
Right.
But yes, the reasons matter. The reason I left is because I was so far ahead of what the teacher was doing that I could not function in a classroom.
Right.
Simply because the teacher can't work to the speed of every kid in the classroom. The teacher has to work. The teacher has to, in a perfect world, the teacher has to work to the speed of the slowest kid in the classroom. And in the world we actually live in, the teacher just works at the teacher's pace, whatever that happens to be.
Right.
And there are limitations to that. And you can't have a 100% perfect classroom system that fits the individual needs of every kid, because that's not how it works.
Right. Right.
What you need is some sort of system of social schooling. I've always liked the model of the free school, where the school is open and the teachers are there and the kids can go in and out and do what they and learn what they want to learn and go where they want to go and do what they need to do. But I'm hopelessly behind or ahead of the times. I don't know which.
Right. I don't know. I mean, in a fair society where the end goal was for people to be able to think critically, find resources to support what they say, to learn to look beyond the easiest thing that is presented and to find the things that are maybe less obvious, but actually will help to formulate a true like analysis of whatever it is that you're looking at, right? If the goal was to teach people to communicate, to respect humanity, to respect nature, like, all the things, right? Then people within an educational setting would be getting all the things, and it would be actually odd to be the person that pulls your child out of this system to go do something different, right? Like, part of the issue here is not no one, but there are so many people who are incapable of thinking for themselves.
Yes. And
right?
And you have to believe that a great deal of that has been programmed into them by a school system that tells them to sit quietly and do what they're told.
Right. Right.
Which was also something I will admit I had a problem with. I was not good at sitting quietly and doing what I was told.
Right. So, it's such an awful situation, especially like as a parent who, when we moved, it was about like, where can we, are we going to be able to send him to the schools? Even though, New Jersey, shockingly enough, has a fairly decent like school system.
That doesn't shock me, because I know how rich New Jersey is now, despite the image of New Jersey cities And despite the sort of Jersey Shore, I mean, you got to remember, yes, they're dirty and vulgar, and they were dirty and vulgar and awful on Jersey Shore, but they could afford to be. These were not poor people,
right? And so, you know, and I've said it here and in multiple places, like, you know, we do okay. Like, the school district is good. We still opted to send him to private school. Now, in part because he got a very large scholarship because the child is a brain. But because we really wanted him to have an educational experience that we felt like was really gonna teach him to think for himself.
Yeah.
And that wasn't gonna be just about, you know, passing the test and doing the things that the system tells you to do. You know, and I frustrate my son because I'm always dragging him to different things, like come with me to this march, or come with me to this presentation, or come watch this movie. And, you know, I know in his brain, he's like, Lord have mercy, mommy. Like, we're always doing these things, right?
I think it's good you're doing that, because if he's in that private school environment, it's actually probably good to be pushed to that in that other direction too.
Right. And so, you know, a lot of what I find to be the guide for people is like I'm trying to think of how to explain it, because this is what I see all the time with things, right? Like, people are so comfortable.
Some defensive of white people in New Jersey. And that's fair. I'm sure it doesn't represent everybody.
That's right. Go Best, fight for your rights. You know, the real issue here is that people simply don't invest the time and energy into doing things for themselves and learning things for themselves and going beyond what they're told to, you know, create a definition on their own of what is valid, what's important, what's necessary. And people are so readily eager and able to just be like, oh, well, so and so said that, so like we just gonna roll with that, right? And not take any time to like really step back and look at what's been presented and make a decision for yourself as to whether or not for you that particular thing makes sense, right? Is it sourced? Is it reasonable? You know, it's just, it is really hard to be a person who gets like secret joy into figuring things out in so many spaces where people are okay just like kind of consuming nonsense and consuming what they're told, and you know, it's just, I don't know. It's a hard situation, and schools are really tricky, because if you live in an area where the tax code means that people pay a lot of money in property taxes, and therefore the schools are well funded and they have access to all the things, it's a very different experience in those places. What's accessible, let me be clear, what's accessible is a very different experience. However, if you are the student who is coming from the poor part of town and going to that school, what is accessible to you may not be achievable for you, right? Because if you don't have food at home, if you have to walk a mile to get to school at 7:00 in the morning, if you don't have parents to help you with your homework, if your internet is always getting cut off, like all of those other things, right? Those can seriously impede your ability to utilize the very same resources that are made available to you because you happen to live in a district where the majority of the people pay a lot of property taxes. There's just so much there's so much discrepancy like within the system. And I see what Connor's saying. And you know what? I went to private Catholic school too. Like,
and if you're, and I'm sure you might have you might or might not have comments on this. I don't know, but it can be difficult if you're, I imagine, if you're the black scholarship kid at the private school where the white parents sent their kids to get away from black kids.
Right. And, you know, I went to a very small private school, private Catholic school. But it just so happened that my graduating class happened to be relatively diverse considering the school, right? Like, I wasn't the only black girl. I wasn't even close to the only minority.
To be fair, Catholic schools can be better at that than some other Christian schools. Right. So they can also not be. It really depends on the Catholic school.
Right. And in addition to that, there were poor white people in my graduating class.
Yeah.
Right. So there was a real, you know, and poor is relative, right? Like it, you know, they weren't the same level as all the, you know, some of the other girls. So we had a real hodgepodge in my class. But so that really changed what my experience was in that school, right? Like it was a very different experience for me than the girl in the class behind me, who was the only black girl in that graduating class, right? Like it's a whole different experience.
I bet.
And what Connor says, you know, like depending on where you are, you might have none.
It's true.
Right? Like there are plenty of places where there ain't a black person in sight.
And as one reads the plans of the people who have all sorts of ideas for Christian education, a lot of these Christian schools have a tendency to end up being all white or all black for some reason. I've been doing a whole lot of research. So for anybody who does not understand this, because I've mentioned this on the show a few times and I've written about it, but not everybody who's heard me mention it on the show has read what I've written about it. Mm-hmm. So the Classics Learning Test is an alternate standardized test that is supposed to emphasize Western civilization, and is the people who run it are pretty much part of the attempt to do a Christian takeover of education. It's important to understand that up front. Right. They talk a lot about liberal arts and classical education, but when they say classical education, what they are talking about is what used to be considered the Catholic school canon, is the best way to put it. Mm-hmm. They're talking about what Catholic schools have traditionally taught, sometimes spun off into an evangelical version instead. The CEO is a really interesting guy who's a Catholic now, but graduated from a Calvinist seminary. Mm-hmm. So now there's a combination for you. He's a Catholic, but he graduated from a Calvinist seminary. Right. So he's the police both before and after Reform. Right. So I've said before that Nazism is the part of Christianity that white Catholics and white Protestants agree on. Mm-hmm. And I think that is important to understand when you see a educational organization stacked with both Catholics and Protestants, most of whom are white. I say most of whom because there is an interesting smattering of both serious black academics and people who would look like serious black academics on the surface. But when you actually go into what they do at Princeton, right, you realize they are crazy Christian academics. Yeah. The one person who is very interesting, when you see that somebody has an ecumenical Christian studies position at Princeton, you think Princeton, Ivy League. They're not going to hire whack job Christians to run their Christian studies. They're going to be ecumenical. Apparently not. Right. and someone who did not look deeply into her actual record on issues and her actual curriculum in the classroom would see, oh, liberal black academic Princeton, this must be an okay organization.
Right.
But she's actually a scary Christian.
Right.
There are several other, the president of the organization is another person who on the surface looks very, very liberal and acceptable, and oh, this is good. We'll be safe with this organization. Look at this wonderful black lady who's the president of their academic advisory board.
Right.
Only it turns out that she wrote a book explaining that we're a Christian country and our shared Christian tradition is what holds us all together. And that shared Western Christian identity brings us together, black and white, as one American people.
Right.
There are some problems with that.
There's a whole lot of problems with it. And, it's funny because we talk about it. We talk about it a lot. And my whole thing with that entire scenario with that test, and the research you've done is great. So this is not to try and bypass that.
It's just another standardized test scam.
Right.
At the same time.
Like my question remains, why are we adding another standardized test to the list? I don't even understand why that's part of the conversation.
So it's a capitalist thing.
Of course.
You can't overlook the capitalist part of this. And this goes back to something I've said before, that I've said repeatedly, and that I think this organization proves in a way that no other does. Nazis are always grifters.
Right.
I've said it before, the guy who brought the KKK back in the 1920s and they took over the state of Indiana, he also happened to own the biggest dry cleaners in the state, and it was really good business for him if people needed to keep their sheets white.
Right.
And you can't overlook that aspect of it. Every attempt to organize a fascist organization in the United States on the same scale as the now defunct American Nazi Party has fell apart when the leader was exposed as stealing from the other Nazis.
Right.
And he was grifting his own base in shameless and terrible ways. And in at least one case, abusing their kids.
Right.
And so all this stuff, the Nazis are always grifters. They're always making money off it in some way. And the fact that at basis, the real question at the bottom is, do we really need another standardized test? And everyone knows the answer is no. Standardized tests are part of the problem.
Right.
The only people who think that standardized tests are part of the solution are politicians, because standardized tests are easy and simple for politicians.
Right.
It's just, of course we don't. And that's part of what makes it so perfect for Nazis, because there's that capitalist grift on top of all the political stuff.
Right.
This brings me back to...
So the funny part is, though, about the standardized, which makes the timing of this even more bizarre in my brain, right? And I understand, I think they actually kicked off in was it 2017 maybe? So, this organizing around creating this new test happened before COVID.
Yes.
But COVID unintentionally destroyed standardized testing, right?
Yes.
It's dying a slow death.
Yeah.
And I don't know if people are even fully aware of the slow death that it is dying.
Well, these people are all people who clearly are deeply invested in standardized testing in various ways, whether as college admissions people, or people who run private schools,
right,
or academic figures who are pushing their solutions for education in America.
Right. So they're gonna have to make some adjustments to the purpose of their test.
Well, but that's the best part, because this is where they're ready for COVID in ways that some groups aren't, because a bunch of members of their board are already in the wonderful testing consultant business, where if you can afford them, they set up the opportunity for you to go in and take the test on a one-on-one.
No, I think colleges are not the number of colleges that have gone test optional is rising.
Oh, but that doesn't mean you can't scam the parents.
Oh, I know. But what I'm saying is, that's what I mean by it's a slow death.
Like, yeah, sure.
You know, the test optional it's actually always been in existence, which I don't think people realize.
But but do we have test optional high school and elementary schools yet?
No, but you have public schools that don't require any testing at all.
Of course.
Right?
Of course.
And and that's what I mean. Like, they'll have to make their adjustments, how they make their adjustment. I was just really looking at the hilarity of that. They kind of stuck their toe in this thing, not realizing that they were going down a bad path.
There's one part of it that unless the actual educational system changes in some way, there's one part of it they've got exactly right. It's something the CEO says. He talks about public schools and that how federal funding is dependent on test scores, and that as a result, schools tend to teach the test.
Right.
Which means his argument for selling the test, and I know you've looked at the test and it's not really that different, and so there's a lie in his argument here too. But you have to understand that his argument to sell this to parents and to colleges and to Christian right-wing groups that want to take over education, his argument is because schools teach the test, if we get this test out there enough, then everybody will be doing Christian education because they'll have to teach this test too.
Right. And the fundamental part that he's really missing, which, I mean, Lordy, how'd he miss this part? I'm struggling to understand. So school districts do not give national tests for their, like, each state has its own testing system, right?
Of course.
And so this is not a national now the tests all come out of a national company.
Well, one of the reasons though that he was running op-eds praising Ron DeSantis is because, of course, Ron DeSantis added him to their state testing.
Right,
system.
But it's their state testing for, I think it's not for, is it for high school and elementary school? I thought it was just for admission.
It's admission for the Florida State College system.
Right.
However, the idea they're also, and this is important to understand, that there are aspects of this organization that go beyond the test and actually go into formulating of policy and reshuffling of state funds. DeSantis is the perfect example. It's not a coincidence that the CEO of the organization was praising DeSantis.
Right.
DeSantis made a member of the organization, Erica Donalds, a part of the board of trustees of Florida Gulf Coast University when he was making all those changes to Florida Gulf Coast University that were in the news that people were trashing. Right. So if you really want to read between the lines, all those op-eds praising Ron DeSantis's educational policy were really the CEO of the CLT company praising Ron DeSantis for putting a member of his organization on the board of a school.
Right.
It's also important to understand that they are pushing for the kinds of political changes that DeSantis made at the same time that they're in the guise of selling the test.
Right.
And it's the way the two work together that I find fascinating.
It's fascinating. And I will say the thing that I think bothers me.
And for anybody one more thought, sorry to interrupt. For anybody who doesn't know it yet, if you watch the Trump drama and the House speakership drama, Byron Donalds, the MAGA guy from Florida, who's always on the news, Erica Donalds is his wife.
Wait, say that again?
Byron Donalds, Black Republican MAGA congressman from Naples, Florida.
Mm-hmm.
Erica Donald's on the CLT board is his wife.
Oh.
His white wife.
Mm.
So this is another couple that is willing to teach that their own marriage is anathema in the eyes of God, without necessarily being worried about the consequences for them personally, like Clarence Thomas and Ginny.
Right.
Which I don't understand, but I guess they really feel serious about their religion.
And people often do,
Yes.
So my thought process, and this is the only part of it that gives me an inkling of like a niggle of like how is this going to go badly for everybody else? So that is all happening. And at the same time, you have the College Board doing years of research to pull together a course on African American studies. Now, I say this with the caveat that I understand that the College Board is a fake nonprofit and that they're also all about making money and that their goal actually has nothing to do with anything outside of making a profit.
But their data is often good.
Exactly. And also, if you're teaching an AP level class, and I know this for certain because I have seen the process to become an AP teacher and because I have seen what an AP class looks like if it's actually taught like an AP class. They can be excellent classes, right? Like you can really give a student an opportunity to read outside of the normal curriculum, to have discourse that is not typically involved in the curriculum, to critically think, to learn to write, to learn to resource themselves properly, like all the things, right?
Yeah.
And so when the College Board decided that they were going to do this African American Studies class, I remember thinking to myself, well, they certainly found a way to like chime in and make some money off of, the murder of George Floyd. But okay, that aside, at least they decided to do it. So I was going to try not to be too harsh about it. And then I found out that they were changing the curriculum and making things that had initially been required as part of the curriculum recommended as part of the curriculum. And it was all based on the response that the Florida Department of Education had towards the course. So this is where my only level of like really comes in with these things, is because like you want to, as a person with common sense, right? Like you want to be dismissive of Florida. Like they're all crazy MAGA racists, anti-LGBTQIA, like the whole thing, right? But people also, I think, misjudge how hard these people work at making sure that the thing they want happens.
Also,
right?
And when you talk about dismissing Florida, for everyone out there who dismiss all of this stuff because Florida, well, let me point out that the guy who put together the sort of modern eco-fascist playbook, John Tanton, did not come from the South, but from Michigan. That the school that is one of the private Christian colleges that is most closely involved with organizations like the CLT organization, and is most active in pushing private Christian schools with no federal funding, Hillsdale College, is based in Michigan. Some of these schools are based in California. Some of these academics teach at Princeton and Harvard. As someone else did mention, yes, Dr. Cornel West is on this academic advisory board. Now, his role on this academic advisory board, I am told, was primarily making sure that Toni Morrison and James Baldwin were included on the test. And that sounds great, but he's still participating in this process to foist yet another test on school kids who don't need another one, as Renee has said. And he's doing so with some of the worst possible people he could choose to do it with.
Right.
I mean, everyone, with the possible exception, and I say possible because I don't know what his investments look like, but with the possible exception of Dr. West himself, every individual on that board is either making money off of Christian charter schooling in some way, making money off of corporate charter schooling in some way, or a horrible Christian nationalist. Often some combination thereof. And even many of the black academics who look superficially acceptable turn out, when you dig down on their records, to be the same kind of Christian nationalist.
Right.
Which then raises the question, despite all the things he has been good on, it raises some of the questions of things he hasn't been good on. How does Dr. West feel about Christian nationalism?
Right.
And one of the reasons...
it's a question you've, I think, posed a few times.
I have. And it's just because he appears to think that it's okay to sit on this board with some of the worst people in the country because he's such a good person. You take this into account with the Harlan Crow donation that got returned.
Right.
You take this into account with the fact that he and one of the right-wing members of the board, who was at the time a colleague of his at Harvard, and with whom he is famously close friends, both got up on their very large platforms to yell and deride college anti-racists who shouted down Charles Murray.
Right.
Saying that they were bullies and thugs who were not respecting this fine academic's right to speak. Do y'all know who Charles Murray is?
Right.
Charles Murray is the guy who wrote The Bell Curve. Charles Murray is on record believing black people are stupider than white people. I apologize for the ableist language, but that is what he believes.
Well, I mean, that is what he believed. Right.
But Cornel West is concerned about his free speech and not the free speech of students at the institution where he has a platform. That seems self-interested on some level. Like he's more worried about being shouted down by right-wingers than he is about student freedom of speech.
Right. Sanctions kill kids has been really, they're so like on point.
Oh yes.
Just a note as I like kind of track it in the
wants to reverse the trend of younger white kids at least not wanting to be racists and youths in general becoming more LGBTQ friendly. Exactly. Right. This is the thing. When white parents say, my kid was traumatized, what they're actually saying is, I'm traumatized because the school is not letting me teach my kid how to be the racist that I want them to grow up to be.
Exactly.
I want my child to look down on black people and I want them to dislike queer people. And the school is ruining that for me.
Right. Right.
And that's not so. Okay. Because you asked this question, and because I know what he said on Twitter about it, I will address this. Dr. West answered this question on Twitter, even though it was not asked this explicitly.
Mm-hmm. He
reductively compared Hitler to Stalin and Mao, and also reductively said that Harlan Crow kept this museum of memorabilia of tyrants as a warning and a reminder, and this museum of memorabilia about great American patriots like Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln as an inspiration. And it's like, the least objectionable person in that group was Lincoln, and he wasn't perfect.
Yeah.
I do feel like if we're going to go there, yes, Abraham Lincoln probably is the least objectionable president in American history who didn't die 90 days after being president. But, that's a low bar. Abraham Lincoln had problems too. And for all the things that he was good on, he still sent a general to Minnesota during the Civil War to exterminate the indigenous people. Right. And we can't ignore that. And this is a really good point about Washington. Because yes, people like Washington and Jefferson are consumed by contradictions that put them in both categories. Washington had all of these very high-minded ideals about the proper administration of an aristocratic republic, but he still wanted an aristocratic republic. He freed all his slaves who he still owned in his will, but he had made his money selling a whole lot of them south to much worse owners. This is important to understand about Virginia and the economic position that Virginia occupied in the slave capitalist system. So obviously, if the business of the South is slave-driven agriculture, you need a supply of slaves. Originally, the slaves came from Africa. And then later, when that wasn't allowed anymore, they came from the Caribbean. And then when the Haitian Revolution happened, and that was a lot more difficult, they came from Virginia. The way that all of the they didn't care about slavery and they were good masters, regardless of whether of the falsehood inherent in many of those they were good masters stories, it doesn't matter because they made their money selling people to much worse owners, to much worse situations, knowing that they would die. Part of the system of slavery that we do not talk about enough is that a plantation in Louisiana or Mississippi was a de facto death camp. They needed to buy new slaves all the time because field hands died on a massive level. They could not just rely on their own slaves' children because kids did not grow up fast enough. So they bought slaves from Virginia. The tobacco farmers in Virginia did not run the same kind of killing industrial farming operations that the indigo and rice and cotton and turpentine plantations in the Deep South did. The people in Virginia who thought their slaves didn't have it so bad may or may not have been right in the grand scheme of things by the material arguments of the time, but their money was based on feeding the death camps in the Deep South. I mean, the average lifespan was like 24, 25 if you were a field hand.
That sounds right.
The average that you could be expected to survive as a field hand was like 2 to 3 to 5 years in some states at the most. Is really scary when you look at the numbers. It's terrifying.
Yeah.
It's genocide on a scale that we don't acknowledge. And, we don't teach that. Even when we talk about teaching Black history, we don't really teach about the U.S. being in the genocide business for 50-some years.
Right.
More than that, 100 years. And more than that before it was the U.S.
Right.
But we're supposed to just take this quaint Christian nationalist vision. Christianity binds us all together. Well, how did half of that group become Christian?
Right. Right. Because it wasn't by choice.
No, there's a joke. There's a joke by a Malawian comedian named Delisa Chipando. Crazy white things. He talks about, because he's from Malawi. He lives in Manchester in the UK. He went to school in Europe. He's a very cosmopolitan guy. He talks about how a friend of his from college, a guy from Denmark named Matthias, was going on a hike across Africa. And he was calling friends of his and, and family members and asking if his friend could stay with them. And his uncle calls up, very offended that he wasn't called, and says, "Why didn't you ask me? I want your friend to stay with me. I can make rice." And I guess he figured white people like white food or something.
Right.
And so then he goes on but he talks about his friend staying with his uncle, and his uncle calling, "I'm very upset. It's not like television at all. You gave me a defective white man."
Right.
And he says, "What do you mean? He's not doing any crazy white things. I wanted a story for the bar." And so he calls his friend. He says, "You have to do some crazy white things. You got to give him a story like he wants." And so he said, "Okay, I don't want to be a stereotype, but okay, I'll try." And then the punchline. So a few months later, I hear from my uncle, "My friend Mateus slept with his wife and took his land and made him a Christian." Crazy white things.
Right.
And I mean, and that's what the history comes down to. And when you talk about Christianity binding us together as one people, that's kind of sick.
Right.
And that has to be talked about. And if you're ignoring that and you're just telling what you think are the good parts and ignoring the genocide machine that inflicted Christianity on, I don't understand that. I don't understand how anything good comes of that.
Right.
I'm sorry, I'm going off.
It's okay. But it's because, again, you have so much of the encyclopedic historical knowledge about how so many things, like the movement to this point where we are right now, right?
Yes.
And I don't have that knowledge, so I'm not going to pretend to have that knowledge. I did work in the public schools in Virginia. I don't know if I ever told you that.
I did. I don't think I knew that. No.
I did for almost I guess it was almost 12 years. I worked at a middle school in rural central Virginia, which was an interesting experience for 2 years. And then I worked at a public school in one of the biggest districts in Virginia. And the school that I worked at, I believe, stopped using Johnny Rebel as their mascot. Within 1 or 2 years when I started working there. And I started working there in 2001. And there was a whole fight about the Confederate flag. And, Virginia is an interesting place, but it's also, depending on where you are in Virginia, it is a very affluent place.
Yes.
Right? And
especially the closer you get to Richmond and DC.
Right. And so it's
and of course the coast.
Right. And it's a very interesting district. And I mean, honestly, the school was fantastic. They had resources out the wazoo. They got approved while I was working there for Johnny Walker. They actually changed it to the Lions. They became the Lions. And so they got approved for a bond to fix the building, which was very, very old. And they went through systematically and they moved kids into trailers and they rebuilt that part of the building, and the building was gorgeous. And they offered a ton of AP classes, and they offered a tech school, and they offered, anything that a student could have needed to find their path beyond high school was available to them through this district. And so it was interesting because it was also a very diverse population. There was a huge amount of students who were on free reduced lunch. So, when you work in a building where the student population is so varied, and again, like I was saying earlier, what's available to them through the resources that are provided just in general by the school, can really change things. But it's only but so much you can change depending on where you come from in the mornings, right? It's a different dynamic, and it's something that I think people really just don't they don't understand because, people just think, oh, well, your school is what it is when you live there, but your school is what it is when you live there because of the circumstances that are created in the neighborhood outside of that school. Yeah. Right. And
well, you go back and I hate to give Hillary Clinton credit for saying something right, because she was just so horrible at actually implementing anything that actually did this. But I mean, Hillary Clinton's garbage for her, because she didn't mean a word of it. But Hillary Clinton's "it takes a village to raise a child" is not wrong.
No.
We need to have a system of social schooling in our communities, a combination of the free school and the community school, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. For those who don't know what a community school is an alternative schooling center for kids who could not finish or were expelled from high school and have a chance to finish their degree. Now, I think that community school model would work really well for all students, and it's actually kind of depressing that only specific kids who have been expelled get these opportunities, and that worse, they get these opportunities from, in far too many cases, teachers who are independent studies teachers who are completely burnt out because they're overworked by the county system they work for, because none of them actually work directly for school districts, at least not in California, where I became aware of the community school system. Right. So it's really, more people need those opportunities. There need to be more teachers in those schools. And, we have so many great things that we're doing that could be good if they were just done properly, and that could replace what really is, in a lot of degrees, a failed corporate schooling model, because it's not public. You pay for it with your local property taxes.
Right.
But in the end, this community doesn't control the school.
Right.
Political figures control the school. An elected school board controls the school. School board elections are like all the other partisan elections in our system. Worse, they are often cases of some weird Republican running unopposed.
Right.
We don't have a democratic system in so many ways. And schooling is like cops in the sense that it's become a system of management of populations rather than actually serving its stated purpose.
Right. Oh, the time. I have to
Yes.
I just realized.
Yes, we need to wrap up.
We do. But I will let you do your individual wrap as you do when I join. Thank you, as always, for having me on.
Thank you for joining.
And I do really want to encourage people to take a look at the charter schools in their area, take a look at the public schools in their area, and take a look at the private schools in their area. And I think it'll be pretty easy to figure out the disparities. And I think it will also be pretty easy to determine how this solution of charter schools has actually only created a larger problem and not actually fixed the problem that is already in existence.
And I'm going to monologue about that in a moment. So that's the perfect lead in.
There we go. I did my job.
Thank you very much, Renee, for your time, and have a great Sunday.
You too. Take care. Bye.
Take care. So on that note, I'm glad that she mentioned the solution of charter schools, because in many cases, the solution of charter schools is the system by which the Christian schools get their entry. In Florida and in Texas, rules that were passed that benefited charter schools ended up allowing chains of Christian schools to get public money instead of the public schools, and essentially replace public schools for the majority of kids in a lot of districts. It's like how in Oakland and New Orleans, there are no real public schools left that aren't charters because of the corporate process. But it's a Christian process that's happened in the guise of the corporate process, and that has benefited from the corporate process. because the Christian nationalists are more organized than anybody on the so-called left when it comes to actually working locally to influence policy. That's something we need to change. It's why when people say all politics is local, that means that the electoral politics that affects your life and that actually matters is your school board and your public utilities commission and your city government and your county government, much more than the federal or even state government in many cases, though state government can still be important. But it's also important to understand that these systems aren't democratic. You can see in Atlanta that when people vote against the powers that be will still do what they want to do. And a big part of American fascism happens at the local level, where supposedly liberal mayors, captive to their police forces and chambers of commerce, run roughshod over the people that they made promises to in order to get elected, in order to keep promises that they made to the people who funded their elections. This is where I go back to saying we don't have a democratic system, that all electoral politics is ultimately harm reduction at best, and that the most meaningful organizing that we can do is for mutual aid and community defense, and to create systems that can replace public systems. If communities can really school their members, can really educate their members, and don't need the public school system, then that's another area where we can divest from the capitalist state and make some headway. The problem is we're not organizing for that. We're organizing for elections. Something to think about. And on that note, I want to thank everyone for their time today. I want to thank everyone for watching. If you really enjoyed it, hit subscribe, smash the like button, share it on social media, follow us on social media, join my Substack, subscribe to my Patreon. We really need the help to keep going right now, and I appreciate it. I hope everyone has a great weekend, and I'll tweet at you.